And there were a lot of commenting. The State Water Board, I think, did a fabulous job with their environmental analysis. They knew they had to have the tightest document possible, and they did a great job with it. And there were a number of delays on the vote, but finally on December 12th last year, they did approve the 40% unimpaired flow, February to June. So that was a huge victory. They adopted the flows, but there are still 2 more phases that need to happen before things can move forward. Phase 2 is the Sacramento River and Delta outflow, so water coming into the Delta that actually makes it to the bay. And phase 3 is who's going to provide the water. So when you start getting into water rights, and that's going to be controversial. So there's also some flexibility. It's called adaptive management. That flows could range from 30 to 50%. And based on whether biological goals and objectives are met. So the idea is if you can be really proactive with non-flow measures, things like gravel augmentation to help with the spawning beds, predator suppression, that's what that funny picture is on the left on the top, restoring the riparian corridors, there's more shade, there's more food. If you could do things like that and successfully meet the goals and objectives, it could go as low as 30%. But if we're not meeting goals and objectives at 40%, it could go as high as 50%. So what the water agencies are pushing for right now is a parallel process called voluntary agreements. It sounds great, they're voluntary, they're agreements, but what could possibly be wrong with that? And what they're offering is, hey, we'll do a lot of these non-flow measures, but we don't want to give up water. And some state agencies are working with them, and we don't think are very strong. We don't think that the voluntary agreements are really based on science. But the reason they have as much support as they do is that maybe if we avoid lawsuits, something could happen soon rather than waiting 10 or 15 years for lawsuits, and maybe by then the salmon are all gone. So that's happening on a parallel process. The State Water Board, they have drafted their goals and objectives. We haven't seen them yet, but we're expecting them to be released publicly fairly soon. And we've heard they're pretty good. Meanwhile, in the voluntary agreement process, they might come up with a different set of goals and objectives that are easier to meet, and hey, wow, we achieved our goals. In mid-October, we're expecting the State Water Board to make a determination if the voluntary agreements have enough promise to proceed on to environmental analysis. And the voluntary agreements could supplant the Bay Delta plan if the State Water Board chooses to go that way. So all along, the irrigation districts have been very opposed to this plan. So these are the agricultural districts in the Central Valley. And they sued after the State Water Board vote. And the SFPUC joined the San Francisco Public Utilities Commission. So we felt they weren't representing the values of their constituents, people in the South Bay who get Tuolumne River water. But also BOSCA, Bay Area Water Supply and Conservation Agency, they represent San Francisco's customers outside of the city. So there are 26 agencies. Palo Alto, where I live, were one of them. They sued, and then Valley Water here, used to be Santa Clara Valley Water District, they sued. And their reasoning was that, well, this doesn't affect our water supply, but 15% of the water coming into Santa Clara County is from the SFPUC, places like Palo Alto. And if the SFPUC has to do this extreme rationing that they say will be necessary, those agencies are probably going to pump groundwater, and that's going to affect our water supply. So I've been giving them a lot of hell about this, and I think I've been educating them, and I think they kind of get that they made a mistake. They bought the SFPUC line, and they've learned a lot. We just had a great meeting last Friday with some of their senior staff, and trying to move them along. If we can get them to drop their lawsuit, maybe it trickles along to BOSCA and eventually the SFPUC. So this is one reason why San Francisco isn't so good on environmental issues. They have an agreement with the irrigation districts that have the senior water rights on the Tuolumne, that they will support their negotiating position regarding volumes of water provided for fish flows during FERC, which is Federal Energy Regulatory Commission mediation process. So FERC is in charge of providing licenses to dams that generate electricity. Don Pedro does, that was a big dam. And they got their original license in 1966, and they're supposed to get a new license by 2016, 50 years later. We've been working on that as well, parallel to the Bay Delta plan, and it's fallen behind a little bit. But both of these processes are going to sync up, and we'll have some changes on the Tuolumne. So right out of the gate, San Francisco and Bosque said, oh my God, this could cost us 188,000 jobs and $49 billion. Well, we tore that apart, and we presented it in front of the State Water Board, and they're like, wow, that's very interesting, thank you so much. And then a few weeks later, the SFPUC presented, and they didn't say anything about this. And one of the board members said, well, last time you presented, you had these incredible figures that were so scary, why aren't you commenting on that? You want to comment? And they said, well, we're reworking that. But in front of a sophisticated audience, they backed way off of these numbers. So, interesting thing, we've been very successful at reducing water demand in the SFPUC territory. This was 77, the driest year on record. This was the 6-year drought of record in here. And you can see in the last 15 years or so, water use has declined significantly. One reason is the price of water has gone up a lot to pay for a lot of seismic upgrades to the system, but also the drought and the mandate issued by the governor. So in 2016, water demand was lower than it was in 77 despite population growth. This isn't per capita, this is everything. And it was the following year too, in 17. And it's only crept up a little bit since then. So we're probably going to have a plateau for a while, is my guess. But between 2006 and 2016, we've reduced our water use by 30%. That's the equivalent of 30% rationing. Mm-hmm. And what their study said is like, oh, 30% rationing should cost 25,000 jobs and $6.5 billion. But what happened? Jobs increased by 27%. It was one of the biggest economic booms in the Bay Area, and water use declined by 23%. And again, this is overall, it's not per capita, it's overall. So, like, I think your study was a little bit off, not you. We've met with the economist, and he stands by it. It's like, well, but they think differently, economists do. So something I'm putting a lot of energy into now is trying to educate decision makers like the Bosque Board and San Francisco Planning Commission and Valley Water about all the information they don't get from the SFPUC. SFPUC would love it just to be 50% rationing, $49 billion. So explaining how water rights work and storage and all the other factors. So the way it works, in 1913, Congress passed the Raker Act, which allowed San Francisco to build Hetch Hetchy in Yosemite. But the irrigation districts, they were the first in the state to get water rights. So for most of the year, the first about 2,400 CFS, cubic feet per second, imagine a basketball, 24,000 of those coming down the river, belong to the irrigation district. So that's the gray. Anything above that, like when you have a good storm, belongs to San Francisco. And then for 2 months between mid-April and mid-June, that goes up to 4,000. So that's the prime runoff time. So you can see in wet years, San Francisco has really great water rights. In dry years, not so good. And in an average year, San Francisco has the right to capture 3 times as much water as it needs. And actually this number was back from before we saw that plunge in demand. So really it's even better now. So for example, if you have 2 years, when full, their storage, their reservoirs can hold enough water to last 6 years. So if you're down to 4 years worth of water, and that makes them nervous getting that low, and you have an average year, you're going to use 1 year's worth of water that year and the other 2 years worth to fill it up, and then you're back to being full. So the SFPUC has invested a lot in storage. On the Tuolumne, they have reservoirs that hold 660,000 acre-feet. They also have a water bank at Don Pedro, which I'll explain in a minute. And then they have reservoirs in the Bay Area. So 15% of their water comes from Crystal Springs, Calaveras, and some other smaller reservoirs. So their total storage, enough water to last 6 years. So this is Don Pedro. The way the water bank works, so San Francisco helped build that. They paid for about half of it. And they can't access the water. But when their reservoir is upstream, you see Lake Lloyd, also called Cherry Lake, and Eleanor, and Hetch Hetchy, when those are full, but they still have the right to more water, they can bank it in Don Pedro, so they're prepaying. And then, if you have dry years, when they would normally have to let water flow out of the reservoirs, they could hold it back for use in the Bay Area, and then they subtract what they're holding back from Don Pedro. So it's a great system. Hetch Hetchy is about a quarter of their total storage. Their water bank in Don Pedro is about 1.5 times the size of Hetch Hetchy. So at the height of the drought, you see that dip over there. San Francisco still had enough water in storage to last 3 years. So the water bank got pretty low, but they always keep Hetch Hetchy pretty full because that's our water supply. So they can figure out how are they going to meet their Raker Act requirements by using Cherry or by using the water bank. And then you see that as we're getting into 2016, the water bank starts filling up pretty quickly. 2016 was an average water year. And by the summer of 2016, San Francisco's storage on the Tuolumne was at 85%. So the state was still technically in drought, but San Francisco had enough water in storage the last 5 years. So we weren't close to running out. We didn't broadcast that because we wanted people to conserve. It's a good habit to be in. In some communities, they really had to. So in 2017, this was the second wettest year on record in the Tuolumne watershed. Kind of hard to see, but what they needed 373, I believe, 1,000 acre feet to fill up their storage. And they had the right to 3.1 million acre feet. They had a right to enough water that year to last 12 years. But they only had 1 year's worth of storage available. So almost all that water had to be dumped down the river. And I'm going to show you something about that. This year, you remember it was a little bit wetter than normal, but it wasn't a huge water year. They got enough water. They got over 1.6 million acre feet. That was their rights. They didn't have the space to keep it. And you see back here that their total storage is 1.45 million acre feet. So last year, there was enough water to fill the whole system. And we had those storms in May that were a little bit unusual. We had a lot of snowpack. So you see here are storms, here's snow melt. But it's really remarkable how much water they have available in average water years. So what we did is we modeled, well, what would happen if we had a repeat of the 6-year drought of record? And a friend of mine, he just looked at the tree ring data that goes back 1,100 years, and they can tell when we had droughts and such. And he's pretty certain that this was the driest period on the record. There were longer droughts, but a lot of times there would be kind of a normal water year in there. And so this drought put the most demand on water supply. And we looked at water demand rebounding to where it was before the drought, so about 14% higher than it is right now. The 40% unimpaired flow that the state is asking for. And we assume no rationing in the first couple of years because we don't really know if we're in a drought. And then it's like, oh, let's do 10% a couple of years and 20% a couple of years. So an average of 10%. And we found they could manage the drought of record. But they wouldn't have a lot of water at the end, but they wouldn't run out of water. And the SFPUC said, well, yeah, your model, we can't really find any flaws in it, but we're planning for our design drought. So they manufactured a drought that combines the 6-year drought of record followed immediately by the driest 2-year period on record, 76, 77. They don't want rationing to go above 20%. And they're planning for a demand level of 265 million gallons per day. So about, I think it's 26% higher than it is right now. And This shows you how others plan for drought. So here's SFPUC, 8.5 years. Most water agencies have only planned for about a 3-year drought. The governor did a few years ago require that in 2020 they planned for 5 years, but still SFPUC is a real outlier. So demand is a huge part of this, supply, demand. And in 2007, when the WSIP is Water System Improvement Program, so this is a series of seismic upgrades, rebuilding dams, tunnels, pipes, etc. $4.8 billion that we're paying for now. So the price of Hetch Hetchy water has tripled since then, and that sent a really strong price signal and kind of keeps people from going back to a crazy watering schedule. Back then they were projecting that by 2018, demand would be 285 million gallons per day. But they didn't want environmental groups to sue them because they were planning to take another 25 million gallons of water per day from Tuolumne. So we compromised and they capped sales at 265, and they said we're going to focus on recycling, conservation, and groundwater to make up the difference. And that price of water got people paying more attention, and before the recent drought kicked in, we were down to 223, so that's a number that we use a lot pre-drought. 2016 it was 175. 2017, 180. Last year, 196. This year it's going to be right around 196. So water demand in 2018 was 31% lower than what they projected. And that's something that we point out often. It's like, what's the source of your information? The same agency that was off by 31%. So there's an economist, retired economist, who used to serve on the Revenue Bond Oversight Committee for this funding for the WSIP, sharp guy. And he basically has modeled demand based on price elasticity, that if the price goes up, demand's going to go down. And the blue is actual, so here, and then it's what he predicts. And the gray is what his model predicted if you backcast. So you can see he was incredibly accurate for 20-some years, and he's saying it's going to probably stay where it is or go down a little bit. So we also looked at, okay, well, what if the SFPUC implemented its rationing scenario under the design drought, and we had the 6-year drought record, and then you had 93 where the system started filling up, and by 94 it was pretty full. And so they're saying, well, we have to, 223 MGD, we have to have 39% rationing for 3 years and up to 49%. And at the end of the drought, they'd have enough water in storage to last more than 2 years, which again is their goal, because, well, what if we have 2 more years of drought? But if it did repeat as it was, and maybe that's prudent, but if it did repeat as it did, people will be wondering, it's like, why did we have to do all this rationing, and we had economic impacts and stuff, and Hetch Hetchy is still full, and other reservoirs still have a lot of water. So that would be, it's a tough position to be in because we don't know what's going to happen, and water agencies are all extremely conservative. Running out of water for them is not an option. But could we maybe soften this a little bit? I mean, especially since their design drought is very arbitrary. So we commissioned a public opinion survey in San Francisco a little over a year ago, and we found very, very high approval and support for environmental protection, and affordable housing was pretty high, and then as you get down into office space, people weren't so supportive of that. And we found that environmental concerns were the main motivator in why people conserve water. And I'm sure all of you conserved water partly because, well, we're in the drought and I was asked to, but also I want to benefit the environment. But what happened to the water we all conserved in the SFPUC service territory, it didn't benefit the environment during the drought. Because what they did, right now, the releases are based on base flows, meaning that they have to have a certain amount of water flowing down the lower Tuolumne. So, well, why would we provide more than that, especially if we're in the 2nd or 3rd year of the drought? So they just provided these base flows. And you see here that for 5 years, the average unimpaired flow was 12% in the Tuolumne. So 2016, this was an average water year. They only released 8% because they weren't at full storage. And the Tuolumne really suffered. And then you see in 2017 that was that big water year where they had to dump most of the water, and the unimpaired flow was at 79%. For San Francisco, they had to dump 88% of the water they were entitled to. So we had one super overkill great year for the Tuolumne. I mean, all the floodplains were activated for months and months at the expense of 5 terrible years. And that's what the Bay Delta plan is trying to correct, maybe 40%. And then even in 2017, it probably would have still been 50 or 60%. So another reason why they're holding back water and being very conservative, they're looking at 2040, and they have their demand projections, and then Plan Bay Area came along. So this is required for metropolitan areas that to take a look at how we're going to manage the jobs housing imbalance, how we're going to address traffic, etc. So the question here wasn't what do we want the Bay Area to look like in 2040. It was like, well, how many jobs are going to be created? And a lot of this is like cities saying we want to create a lot of jobs. It's like, well, so how many people are going to come, and how do we put people close to the jobs and reduce the housing crisis and traffic gridlock? But the jobs have vastly outpaced housing in the time that we've seen between 2010 and now, probably by about 5 to 1. And so we only added 13% of the housing we needed, but half of the jobs were created. So the jobs housing imbalance is one of supply and demand. And supply means we don't have